I once knew a guy who was into fruit, so to speak. He'd bore a hole into one end of a watermelon, and so did his dingle, and let it fly. He apparently found the sensation interesting and began experimenting. He found that slightly overripe melons were the best, as far as the texture and sensation went, as the texture was apparently more cottony, as he put it. I can certainly see why there'd be moisture. Anyway, the real breakthrough though, happened when he bored another hole in the other end, and slipped a vibrator into it. He raved about it for days. I haven't heard anyone talk about sex in such glowing terms since high school. As we began, one by one, to lose their virginity, it was like he discovered a whole third gender of people, with whom he was still a virgin, and began to seek his one true love. Things began to get a little strange. He really got into his experiments. He was going through 6 or 7 melons a week, easily. He acted like some horrible mutant psychological crossbreed of sex maniac, junkie, and quivering romantic. I never had the courage to ask him what he did with the watermelons afterwards. I almost did once, but I realized that it might be a rather personal issue, at least with him. He tried lots of different permutations. A vibrator at the edge, vibrator at the top, 2 vibrators, one at each side, vibrators in both sides and one end. He spent a lot of money on vibrators and watermelons. At one point, I later found out that a girl that we both knew demanded the immediate return of her toys when she found out what he'd been doing with them, which made us all wonder. She didn't mind if vibrators been used on another person, but it bothered her that it was in fruit, so to speak. He got obsessive. He drew diagrams. He experimented with different sized vibrators, a set for different pulse rates. He even took the vibrators apart to see if he could alter the way they worked. It was a real classic bit of mad science, which is how I got involved. He asked me to rig one of the vibrators so they could all be turned on and off with one switch. A week later, he came back to me with a problem. The perfect vibratory rate for this particular brand of vibrator was when the batteries were about half dead. Could this somehow be simulated? I wound up finally wiring up things together with an old Christmas lights and a toy train transformer, so we could vary the flow of juice, so to speak, to whatever suited his, fancy. I took the extra special care with soldering and insulation. Everything was waterproof by the time I was done with it. I learned my lesson well when it came to penises and electricity, you see. Finally, towards the end of that very odd summer, I received a very special invite onto my answering machine. He'd apparently completed his experiments that previous day and had mapped out the size and volume of the ideal melon, and a number of placement of vibrators to ensure the maximum intensity. The next day, he intended to have the ultimate vigor-sexual experience? Would I like to come watch? There would be wine and cheese, and a hallucinogenics buffet. I wouldn't be alone. He invited guests. I kind of wanted to, I admit it. I thought about it. It was an extremely bizarre thing, and I did a bizarre from time to time. But I had to work the next day. And somehow, the idea of skipping work to watch a guy fuck a fruit somehow just wasn't something I could reconcile to myself. That, and if bestiality was illegal, what would they do to you for screwing a vegetable? I could just see the local cops bursting in to grab some high-profile headlines. And then there were his friends. I knew some of them, and many of them were serious weirdies. I thought. Would the chick with the pierced nipples who'd like to go topless be there, I wondered. Pierced nipples were a lot less common then, and she and I hit it off pretty well at our first meeting. But if this was a party, and his friend who claimed to be married to his dog would likely be there too, and for some reason, this guy seemed to think I was his friend last time we'd met, I'd learned more about dog plumbing than I ever wanted to know. I begged off. Apparently, I missed quite an event. I'd heard about the happenings no less than 5 times the following week from the assorted people who'd been there. Our hero made quite the party out of it. Open bar for the guests, the promised buffet, complete with drugs and finger sandwiches. And he was answering the door and nothing but a pair of gold lame ball huggers. In the kitchen, he duct taped melons to a large cutting board and braced it on the kitchen table. When everyone was there, the festivities began, so to speak. He ditched the bull huggers. Someone offered to fluff him, and he graciously agreed. Much arousal and amusement ensued, particularly since the fluffer was apparently a guy. Finally, his manhood erect and ready, approached the cutting board. The openings had been drilled, the vibrators inserted, and the wiring arranged. I never saw this particular melon, mind you, but I can imagine it easily enough. His later experiments were so full of parts and wires, I'd taken to think of it more of a Borg melons. He lubricated himself thoroughly, and entered the fruit. The crowd watched breathlessly. He switched on the vibrators, the air filled with the hum of fruit come alive, and the smell of an excited watermelon. He groaned. The crowd gasped. He began to slowly stroke in and out of the melon. His eyes rolled back. Plainly, he was feeling no pain. The crowd began to get into it. He thrust into the fruit, harder, deeper. The crowd began to chant, "Go! Go! Go!" He began to lose control, furiously hammering the fruit. A couple of the crowd ran forward, grabbed the table and board, stabilized it. A hero slammed into the melon, harder and harder. The crowd moved closer, gathered around him. They held the table steady, harder, harder, faster. And then, something weird happened. Weirder, that is, than the tableau already before our eyes. In truth, I guess it was my fault. I didn't foresee it, but I should have. I'm the one who wired the vibrators to work in tandem, using the Christmas lights for a model. I should have known that more than a dozen vibrators, all working at the same power source, might well fall into sync, and generate harmonic sympathetic vibrations, which, in a semi-liquid environment, like the inside of an overripe watermelon, would generate positive feedback, increasing by the second. The guys doing whacking in and out wouldn't help. In fact, it probably accelerated the end result. Bottom line, just as our hero reached orgasm, the watermelon exploded, violently, shattering our hero, the kitchen, and the less than an innocent bystander, with, fruit salad, so to speak. No one had noticed the increased throbbing vibrations due to our hero's frantic thrusting.